Hello, this is the backup lecture for ancient history on Thursday, September 24th, 2020. Yeah. You with your technical explanations, expecting everyone to be a scientist just like you.
Turn the page once. Is that so scientific?
You don't understand. There's actually a video that I'd show you all right now if it wasn't for YouTube that has medieval tech support. And there's this monk sitting at his table looking at his book in frustration because they'd used scrolls up until then. And the guy comes in, tech support, and it's another monk, and he tries to explain to him. And the guy just doesn't understand anything that isn't a scroll. So he says, okay, first you got to open the book. Opens the book. And then what am I done? I'm done with this page. What do I do now? And the guy goes slowly and picks up the page, and you turn the page. Oh, that's great. So I go forward and I turn the page. Oh, now I forgot something 2 pages ago. What do I do? Let me show you. Oh, slowly back. Okay, I'm done. What do I do now? I don't know what to do now. I'm done. Okay, you close the book. Oh, I get it. It's a great and funny video. Does a much better job of telling the story than I just did. But anytime you're dealing with new technology or just complicated things, you never know. You might have to teach it. By the way, I know that you knew how to do that. I know he was being a smart aleck. So, I'm just having fun with it, not with you. Where we are is, and I'm going to review a little of this because I didn't get to it in the other 2 classes, and because why not? So, the Iran-Iraq War happens between 2 Islamic societies. And it happens because of racial tensions. The Iranians are Persians, the Iraqis are Arabs. It happens for religious reasons. Like every other major religion, there are different denominations of Islam. In Iran, I want to slide down a little bit. In Iran, there are Shiite Muslims. In Iraq, they were ruled by Sunni Muslims. So there are these tensions. Plus, the socialist Arab dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, he's a Ba'athist, that's Arab socialism, decides that he wants to humiliate Iran because he sees Iran as weak. Iran is not weak. Iran fights back. And so you've got this war going on throughout most of the 1980s that's inconclusive. A lot of people die. Missile attacks happen against Baghdad and against Tehran, the capital cities of both countries. They use chemical weapons, chlorine gas, on one another. I told you about a friend who used to work with my wife back in Maine, who was Kurdish from Iran, and Kurdistan exists in Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. It's not a real country because those 3 other countries keep them down. But her town, her village, was attacked by chlorine gas, and she still has scarring on her skin, and in her lungs, she doesn't have full lung function because of that. When the Fedayeen Saddam came in, the Iraqi troops, and captured her village, they took all the men that happened to be there, and she saw her older brother shot dead in front of her and all the other women and children in the village. This was a terror tactic the Iraqis applied. But as nasty and vicious as the Iran-Iraq War was, in fact, neither side won. It was basically ended status quo ante bellum, which is a fancy way of saying basically where things were before the war happened. But Saddam Hussein has a lot of weapons, and he also, like Hitler, believes that, or Napoleon, believes that boldness rewards the brave. That if you're bold, you can get stuff that you never could get if you were all timid or, afraid. So he decides to be bold. Southeast of Iraq is the coastal, tiny little Kuwait, tiny little Arab nation, Sheikhdom, right here on the coast. But that tiny little country, itty-bitty Kuwait, has one of the world's most massive proven oil reserves that existed back then. And Kuwait is rich, super rich. Iraq has oil. But the oil comes from Kurdish Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, up here near the city of Mosul, and there isn't that much production, not enough to suit Saddam Hussein. So he decides that he's going to make Kuwait, the 19th province of Iraq, and he sends in his tanks, his planes, his guns, his troops, and conquers Kuwait in a night to get the oil, to get the status of actually winning a war for a change. Well, American president at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, says this will not stand. This is an act of open aggression. It violates international law. And President Bush goes to the United Nations and basically gets the authorization to use force against the Iraqis, not in just the name of the American government, but in the name of the United Nations organization. So a coalition of nations, including a lot of former Cold War opponents, begin to show up in Saudi Arabia to fight the Iraqis and drive them out of Kuwait. But the fact that Westerners, Christians, agnostics, atheists, the fact that emancipated women are walking around in T-shirts and no veil, no mask, sometimes giving orders to men, driving cars and doing other things that in Saudi Arabia women were not allowed to do, still largely aren't, that's a problem for many traditional Saudis, including a sheikh named Osama bin Laden. He's part of a minor noble family of Arabs. And he was involved personally in raising money and troops for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Remember, the Soviets were in Afghanistan for 10 years, and we made common cause with the Holy Warriors of God, that's the Mujahideen, teaching them how to use modern weapons and giving them modern weapons and strengthening them to bleed the Soviets and pay them back for Vietnam, which we did. So bin Laden says this will not stand either. Christians in the Holy Land, Christians in Arabia. They may be hundreds of miles away from Mecca, but Mecca's in Arabia, and these troops are in Arabia, and we're going to show them. We're going to show these Israel-loving Americans how we mean business. So he establishes a new organization, the terror organization known as the Base, which in Arabic is Al-Qaeda. And at first, they don't do much because they're just building. But in early 1991, the coalition under American command launches the attack on Iraq. For a full month, we do nothing but airstrikes. Nobody expects this. Usually you do a few days of airstrikes, then you send the troops in, and it's sort of a blitzkrieg, a combination of air and ground battle. The Germans pioneered it. That's why we use the German name for lightning war, blitzkrieg. You'll learn that when we do World War II next year. But we don't do that. We bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb, and the Iraqis are waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting to kill our ground troops, and we don't let them, don't let them. In fact, the Iraqi army and people begin to break under the strain. A month in, we launch a ground attack. In that ground attack, massive numbers of Iraqis try taking a road out of Kuwait back into Iraq. We bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb them. It's called the Road of Death. Now, a lot of people said, well, they're retreating. Yes, after they conquered a foreign country. And if they are allowed to retreat, Saddam Hussein will have his army intact, and he'll threaten somebody else as soon as we're gone. So we killed them, that entire army in retreat. When the war was done, after a few weeks of ground attack, over 100,000 Iraqis had been killed in war. Rightly. Rules of war. Less than 300, fewer than 300 American troops were killed. So this begins a time when Americans think of war as easy. Because we have such high technology, the enemy can't match us. So the complete disproportion between over 100,000 versus less than 300 is just unfortunately absorbed into a lot of Americans' psyche, and they think that our technology allows us to be like superheroes against normal people. It doesn't work that way. Another thing about the Gulf War that has an effect is the high tech is emphasized in the daily briefings of the American general in command, General Schwarzkopf. He would do things like play videos of smart bombs hitting buildings. So you have a TV screen behind him, And what you see is a building, or in this case, a bridge, getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, and then the screen goes, static because the bomb has hit and destroyed the bridge. And it's a precision munition, laser-guided bomb, so it's actually banking and changing course in order to hit the bridge just where they want it hit. Well, nobody planned this. There was an Iraqi on the bridge that happened to see the bomb coming in, and he ran. And he was just fast enough to avoid being killed in the blast. The general said, here's the luckiest man in Iraq, because, otherwise he'd be dead. This gives the impression that not only are we like superheroes against regular folks, but that warfare has become so high-tech, it's like a video game. And again, that's not true. And we will learn how untrue it is in subsequent fighting. But we win the Gulf War. We drive Saddam out of Kuwait, but we don't overthrow him. Instead, he is going to be stripped of having any air force except helicopters. He is going to be under limitations onto how oil can come out of Iraq and be used, so he doesn't make enough money to rebuild his weapons. Basically, he's grounded. Under international law, he's grounded. However, history goes on. The Soviet Union falls in the early 1990s, and the United States is left as the only global superpower. China hasn't risen up yet. In the East African country of Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, a massive famine has happened, but it's man-made. Just like a lot of famines in Africa since the 1970s and 80s, it's a man-made famine. In this case, Somalia's central government has fallen, and Somalia is ruled by a bunch of basically gang lords. They're called warlords. And they each control different neighborhoods in the capital city of Mogadishu or different regions of the countryside. But it would be as if local street gangs in Los Angeles, the Crips and the Bloods, or Los Reyes Latinos, the Latin Kings, or MS-13, basically were their own governments, and they ruled over their own regions. So these warlords are stopping normal agriculture, so people begin to starve. So the international food relief agencies that exist in the United States and Western Europe begin sending food to Somalia. And the goal is to be neutral and to send food to everyone. That's what these relief agencies want to do. But the warlords don't want their enemies to get the food. So the warlords who are in control of the docks in the cities, particularly a guy named Mohammed Farah Aidid, stop the food. They hoard the food. They hold on to the food, and they only give it to their own people. So there's still starvation going on, and different warlords are profiting from this, and their attitude is, hey, we have the food, they don't. They'll starve to death, we'll be left alive, and we get the country. Woo! So this is a human rights disaster in the making. So just after winning the Gulf War, President Bush, after losing the 1992 election, but before leaving the office of the president, President Bush decides to send the U.S. military on a humanitarian mission. American Marines go ashore at Mogadishu, Somalia, and elsewhere. And it's the most surreal thing, because everyone knows it. The Marines are landing as if combat's going to happen, as if the warlords are going to resist. But American media end up on the beach waiting for the Marines. So you actually see video of U.S. Marines coming in, preparing to attack a hostile beach, with American reporters waiting for them. Some of the American reporters needed to be decked because they shined TV lights into guys who had had their eyes adjusted to darkness for the last few hours, and now they're night blind thanks to the TV cameras. Oh, our media. Anyway, the Marines go in, they take control, and at first, everything's fine. The warlords don't make a peep. The food is getting to everyone. It looks like it's a success. That's what goes on for a while. But a few months into Clinton's first term, things change. Mohammed Farah Aidid and others are beginning to make trouble. They're beginning to try to interfere with food shipments again. They're basically challenging the American military. and the United Nations mission that commands them. That's right. These are American troops under United Nations command, not American command. So, I think it's August of 1993, August or September, a decision is made to intervene against the warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. We're going to capture him, and we're going to bring him in, we're going to put him on trial for war crimes. We think he's going to be in a particular business or a particular building in a particular afternoon meeting. So what we're going to do is a daylight raid to capture him. We're going to do it by air and by ground. But the United Nations command refuses to let us use tanks or heavy gun artillery or heavy airstrikes. So we're left with light helicopters, Black Hawks, and Humvees, which are basically big Jeeps, unarmored, with machine guns. The Jeeps, the Humvees, go into the streets of Mogadishu, and the helicopters take off and they head for Aidid's neighborhood. And everyone in Somalia who works for the warlords has a cell phone by this point. So they start calling in and saying the Americans are here, they're going in this direction, they're going this fast, they're on this street on the ground, they're in this place in the air. And so the warlords, all of them know what the Americans are doing because it's daytime and you can see them, and our helicopters are painted black because they're usually used in night operations where we tend to succeed. So we go into the area. We send helicopters to land on the four corners of the building. Send our troops in. Aidid is gone. And at this point, something goes wrong. A local Somali militiaman with a RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, shoots down one of our Black Hawks. This is the Black Hawk Down incident. And there's a movie about it that's actually remarkably accurate. It actually goes light on certain things. Once our helicopter is shot down, our mission changes. It's about saving any Americans on the ground. But again, the United Nations refuses to allow air support that will bomb buildings and kill civilians. It refuses to allow tanks. It refuses to allow artillery. It refuses to allow anything other than the troops we have there. Appeals are made to Washington, D.C., and to President Clinton's defense secretary, and maybe to President Clinton himself, but they refuse to go against the United Nations. So our troops are left in a running street fight that lasts the rest of the day, into the night, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, where we have unarmored cars and transport helicopters. Crowds of Somalis jumped up on a drug called khat, K-H-A-A-T, which is basically like cocaine, are swarming through the streets literally like zombies because of their drug habit. And they are dragging the dead bodies of Americans from the helicopters. They're surging against the forces on the ground. It is awful, and it goes on and on and on. Had we been able to use our full force, but we weren't. So finally, the bloody remnants are pulled out. And the Black Hawk Down incident is an example of America being weak in the face of certain types of missions. Quickly after that, President Clinton pulls us out of Somalia, and it remains a failed state, gang state, ruled by warlords, basically to the present day. It doesn't work. That's 1993. In 1994, a blind sheikh, part of the movement to fight America, because America is the key to protecting Israel, orders an attack on the World Trade Center Twin Towers, the ones I told you about. This is 1994. This is 6-7 years before the 9/11 attacks that destroyed them. His agents, his terrorists, rent a van from a rental company, I think in New Jersey. They load the van up with explosives, drive it into town, park it in one of the underground garages under one of the towers, and leave, and it goes off, and nothing happens. Well, a bunch of people underground are killed, a bunch of cars are destroyed, there's some minor structural damage, but the tower does not collapse. Those buildings were built well. A single truck bomb is not going to destroy them. Here's the funny thing. I love it when evil people are stupid, because they were stupid, because they rented the van under their real names. So they were captured and interrogated and are still being punished. The Blind Sheikh is still in jail. So you hope when you're dealing with villains that they're stupid, because they'll do stuff like that. That was sort of a hint at what was going to come. That the Twin Towers were seen. The Tower of Babel story is something that you're going to learn about. And the Quran has a version of it. Human beings prideful, building tall towers so they can look God in the face. God says, ho ho, beep. Now you can't speak the same language. Beep. Now you're confused. Beep. You're still humans. You're not gods. Get used to it. The idea of bringing down the towers is sort of biblical or Quranic to them. Okay, that's 1994. 1998. One afternoon, 2 American embassies blow up in East African cities. I think it's Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and in Nairobi, Kenya, within a few minutes of one another. You don't have attacks like this simultaneous normally in terrorism. This is a pretty big deal. It's the Al-Qaeda organization behind it. Bin Laden's people have revealed themselves. What we didn't know at the time was that the Al-Qaeda organization was functioning in Somalia during the Black Hawk Down incident, and that they were responsible for a lot of the violence we faced. So Bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda organization, this terror group, brought about a lot of the deaths in Black Hawk Down, and they killed hundreds of African workers at our embassies and killed and wounded dozens of Americans. President Clinton has a chance to assassinate bin Laden. One of his allies gives him up in return for things. But Clinton decides, nah, he's a terrorist. He's not really a national enemy. He's a problem, but we're not gonna take the risk of the political backlash of an assassination. We're just not going to do it. Well, that was before the embassy bombings. After the embassy bombings, Clinton does decide to kill bin Laden. He thinks bin Laden is in a pharmaceutical factory in the Sudan, south of Egypt. So we destroy a pharmaceutical factory to the south of Egypt in the Sudan, but bin Laden's not there. He got wind of it and he was gone. So now there's a personal thing between bin Laden and the President Bill Clinton, and there is also this growing sense that Al-Qaeda is the force that is going to stand up for the faithful of Allah against the evil Americans. In the year 2000, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS Cole, is showing the flag at Aden Harbor. Aden is south of Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Peninsula, near the mouth of the Red Sea. Aden is just off the map right about here. And all of a sudden, a little putt-putt boat comes putt-putting up towards the side. They're warned away, but they don't listen. After all, we're at peace. Boom! Boat explodes. People on the boat are dead. Suicide attackers. 40 or 50 American servicemen, sailors, and officers are dead. And there's a hole in the side of the ship. The ship almost sinks, but is kept afloat, returned to America, and fixed. But this is a gutsy thing. It's a terrorist attack against a military target. Granted, a military target that was on peacetime rules, but still a military target. Do not go near an American warship today when they warn you off. They will sink you. They will shoot you, because you never know when another terrorist attack like that's going to happen. However, being Americans, you may get a chance to go aboard an American warship to tour it. If you get a chance to take a tour of an American ship, I recommend it. It's fun. It's pretty amazing. Submarines, too, even more so. Okay, so now it's the year 2001. The 9/11 attacks have happened. The towers have fallen. The period right after that was surreal. It was horrific. All flight over anywhere in the United States was closed down. The only flights allowed were military jets. No civilian flights for about 4 to 6 weeks. I don't remember. I think it was 6 weeks. So no aircrafts functioning, none at all, because you never know if other attacks were going to happen. We heave a sigh of relief, because the targets Al-Qaeda picked were not nuclear power plants. Had Al Qaeda flown 4 jets into 4 nuclear power plants, we could have been dealing with some genuine radioactive, not atomic bomb explosions, but radioactive contamination that could have poisoned significant swaths of the East Coast for a long time and could have killed millions of Americans with radiation poisoning. Luckily, the Al Qaeda organization didn't think of that. However, anthrax, a highly contagious, deadly disease in powder form, is mailed to a series of American leaders and actually makes their way to them before we realize what's going on. You get a package, a letter, you open it up, and there's this poof of white powder, and boom, you've got anthrax. Our people quickly found what was going on, stopped a number of those packages, but 1 or 2 people were killed. Actually, more, I think. At the same time, 2 snipers, John Muhammad and John Lee Malvo, a black man and a young black teenager, start sniping around Washington, D.C. This went on also for about 6 weeks. You could be pumping your gas. You could be driving on the highway from one of the bridges. You could be walking along the streets. They just started shooting at people. And eventually we tracked them down, found them, and locked them up. Given the name Mohammed, there may have been a connection, but it was never fully established that they were operating in support of terrorism. It was still pretty and it happened right at that time. A month and a half after the 9/11 attacks, in late October, early November, we go into Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan does not have a coastline, so we had to make arrangements with a country called Pakistan, which does have a coastline, which we're going to overfly. Pakistan's dictator, a man named Musharraf, is allies with the United States, but his military has strong ties to the Chinese communists and to the Taliban in Afghanistan. So a lot of people inside Pakistan are pro-Bin Laden, pro-Taliban, anti-American. But the government says, in return for a whole lot of money, yeah, you Americans, you can fly over Pakistan to do operations in Afghanistan. Now remember, Afghanistan defeated a massive Soviet army. So instead of doing that, we do the opposite. We send in a few hundred, not a few 100,000. And those a few hundred are spies, CIA operatives, military intelligence, and they go in to make contact with friendly tribes from our old Mujahideen days. And they, with our help, imagine a bunch of guys on mules, horses, and camels with an American who has a laser targeter targeting a group of government tanks from the hills and American planes swiping in and dropping guided munitions on those tanks. So we defeat the Taliban using this weird medieval and ultra-modern warfare. But we do it mostly with Afghan troops because we want to make sure the Afghans know we're not trying to conquer their country. We're trying to seek their help in getting rid of a government that most of them hate anyway. So the Taliban are overthrown. Sheikh bin Laden is discovered to be in a horribly difficult mountain valley region called the Tora Bora. Now, if we had had a massive army there, U.S. troops and Marines would have surrounded the Tora Bora, gone in and got him. But we were working with our allies. And some of our allies had friendly or sort of enemy agents among them. And our allies also could be bribed and bought off. So bin Laden escaped from the Tora Bora in early 2002 and stayed hidden for many years. But Afghanistan, at least, has no more Taliban and no more Al-Qaeda. 2 years later, in 2000, the next year, in 2002, the terrorism goes on. There's a beautiful resort on the tropical paradise island of Bali, north of Australia, in Indonesia. And all of a sudden, a tourist hotel has a series of explosions, killing many Western tourists, mostly Aussies, but still a lot of Western tourists. And Islamist terrorists take credit for that. Then Richard Reed, a Muslim from Britain, decides he's going to take part in the jihad. He replaces most of the material inside the soles of some thick-soled shoes with explosives and boards a transatlantic flight at Heathrow in London for New York. Halfway across the Atlantic, fellow passengers see him trying to light his shoes on fire. Had he done so, there would have been an explosion. Not a big one, but enough to breach the windows of the cabin. When you're in an aircraft flying over the countryside or the ocean, you're 5 miles up. The air pressure outside is so much lower than what's inside, even a little explosion can blow a massive hole in the side of a jetliner and cause it to go down, cause people to get sucked out. Imagine one of those balloons that you fill up and then let go, and that's the balloon is the plane, and the air coming out of it is the high pressure air that we need to live. But after 9/11, the passengers on flights are not taking any chances, and they beat the living hell out of him. He's alive when they get him to New York and when he's brought into custody. But they beat him to literally a bloody pulp. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy because he was going to kill them all. When he's put on trial, he argues that he's a soldier in a war. His judge, in sentencing him, famously says, "You're not a soldier. You're a criminal. This isn't a battlefield. This is a courtroom. And like every petty thug and criminal, you're going to be punished. You're not going to get a martyr's death. You're not going to get the virgins. You're going to go to prison for many, many years, for the rest of your life. But you're no one special. We're not afraid of you." It was a good speech. And the guy is still in prison to this day. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. In 2003, Iraq becomes our target in the war on terror. Was Saddam Hussein involved in 9/11? No. Was Saddam Hussein involved in international terror? Oh, hell yes. Saddam Hussein was giving $1 million to every Palestinian Arab who killed a Jew in Israel. $1 million. You die a martyr's death, your family gets $1 million. That's quite an inducement. Saddam Hussein has been involved in a number of attacks, including attacks on Americans. So why did we invade? Well, that's part of the reason. Another reason is that our intelligence indicated that Saddam had a secret nuclear weapons program, and Saddam had already proven that he had chemical weapons and was willing to use them. Poison gas. He may have had biological weapons too, like super germs developed in laboratories. Not that would ever happen. In any event, we invade. We conquer the country, but Saddam hides for a while. He's found a couple of years later in what's called a spider hole, which is basically a hole that has an air pump in it and that has some food and has a little toilet area. And basically he's hiding underground from America's troops in his hometown of Tikrit. He's put on trial and executed for his crimes against the Iraqi people and against international law. It's a war criminal. The attacks continue to happen. In 2004, in Madrid, Spain, there's going to be an election on Monday. President Aznar of Spain is pro-American and involves Spanish forces in the war on terror because of the NATO treaty. Most European countries do send forces of some kind or support to Afghanistan because the NATO treaty, our treaty with Western Europe, says an attack on one is an attack on all. Well, the attacks on the World Trade Centers were acts of war, and so a lot of European countries helped us. But this was controversial. On Friday morning, there were a series of explosions in Madrid on commuter trains. Dozens of Spaniards were killed, hundreds were wounded. A few days later, they elected an anti-war candidate, and Spain pulled out of the war. The terrorists killed Spaniards, and the Spanish people gave the terrorists what they wanted: Spain out of the war. In 2005, the same thing happens in London, with the idea of maybe driving the British out of the war. But modern Britain is not Spain. On commuter trains, again, several dozen Brits are killed, several hundred were wounded in some way, shape, or form. But the Brits double down on the war on terror and say, we're coming after you. You kill our people, you're not getting rewarded, you're going to get hurt. In Russia, which has its own Islamic terror problem, in South Russia, there is Beslan School number 1, which is basically a school. It's K through 8 or K through 12 with a few hundred students. Really big school. Really big school. Islamist terrorists occupy the school and hold the kids hostage, demanding the release of several terrorists in Russian custody. The Russians have a history of not giving in to stuff like this. For example, back in the 90s, a group of Islamist terrorists took over a movie theater or an opera theater. It was a theater. And they demanded certain things. And the Russians basically gassed the place with knockout gas and sent in troops. And yeah, a number of Russian people that were in the hostage group died, but they didn't give in to terrorists. They killed them all. At Beslan, what ends up happening is a similar thing. The terrorists end up killing a lot of the kids as the military goes in. Think about what it would take to, as a terrorist, take over an elementary school, middle school. 2008, in Bombay, India, what's now called Mumbai, a series of tourist hotels are bombed by Islamist terrorists. These are, by the way, the big items. If you want to see a list of actual terror attacks, I have listed there a URL you can use, or you can just go online and say terror attacks and name a year, and you'll get some lists. They're huge. Now, something else happened before I get to 2009. What happened is, in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Bush and the American government decide that we're not only going to get rid of our enemies. We got rid of Saddam in Iraq. We got rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We're going to nation build. We're not just going to try to, knock over their anthill and leave. We're going to stay there, and we're going to help them be better people. Well, the thing about Afghanistan is Afghanistan has been resisting foreign influences for thousands of years. No foreigner has been able to hold Afghanistan. Fiercely independent. And their country is more mountainous than Switzerland, which is totally mountains. So once we decide we're going to stay, our enemies in Afghanistan get a lot more support because they can say, oh, they're just like the Russians, those Americans. They're trying to change who we are. So Afghanistan has a running insurgency and an ongoing war that's still going on. And what the Taliban are doing is they're hiding out among their Pakistani friends, waiting for us to leave so that they can march back into power. That would be kind of bad. We don't have an answer for it yet. In Iraq, again, I had some former students who fought in Iraq, and then they were building schools and hospitals for the Iraqis. They were trying to build democracy in Iraq. At first, the democracy was very amazingly successful. Iraqis were going to vote in 2006, I think, was the first election. And to prove they had voted, and to make sure they didn't vote more than once, they had to dip their finger into blue dye, which would take a few days to get cleaned off. The terrorists promised the Iraqis that if we find anyone in your family with blue dye on their fingers, we're going to kill your whole family. And they lived in the neighborhood. A good American election in terms of voter participation, maybe 60, 70, 80% of the American electorate that can vote does. America has a low voter turnout, which I'm okay with, frankly. If somebody doesn't care enough to go vote, I don't want their opinion at the polls. If they care enough, they'll go vote. It's not very hard. But in Iraq, over 90, I think it may have been as high as 95% of the eligible voters voted and got the blue fingertip, saying a decisive bite me to the terrorists. It was amazingly brave, because these are everyday people who could have been killed in their homes. But after a while in Iraq, our enemies continued their ongoing insurgency, and because we were staying to try to build a new, better Iraq, our people were hit, and the war went on for many years, and it's still on a low level going on. If you get involved in a war, you should have an idea of what victory looks like. In World War II, it looked like conquering Germany and Japan, and Germany and Japan have since been friends of ours, but we have troops in Germany and Japan to this day. They're friends of ours. They're in our alliances, but we have troops there to protect them from our shared enemies, the Chinese and the Russians, but also, just to make sure everything continues to go smoothly and not a reversion to fascism. Because we chose to stay a nation built, the wars intensified and went on, and we don't have an idea of what it looks like. Had we just decided that what we were going to do is kick over their anthill, knock over and destroy anyone who fights us, and then leave, whoever gets in power, and if they mess with us again, we'll do the same thing to them, that would have been easier. We'd be in, we'd be out, but we decided to try to do more. In any event, that decision was made long before 2008. In 2009, under the Obama administration, which a lot of people hoped would, not me, but a lot of people, the people who voted for him, hoped that Obama, by being sort of not Bush and anti-war, especially with Iraq, that the terrorists would stop fighting us because Obama's more friendly. Obama went to the Islamic world on an apology tour, apologizing for America's sins, he called them, against Islam in the past. He bowed before the king of Saudi Arabia. Obama was trying to make peace, earnestly and desperately trying to make peace. However, in 2009, an American Army officer, Major Nidal Hassan, a chaplain, an Islamic chaplain, goes into his quarters at the largest military base in the country, Fort Hood. It's basically the whole city of the Army. Takes his sidearm out, he has plenty of reloads, and starts shooting at anyone, shouting Allahu Akbar, God is great, the Islamic battle cry. Eventually he's taken down, he's put on trial, and people try to argue that it wasn't inspired by the war on terror, even though you have a Muslim declaring loyalty to Islamist terror, shouting Allahu Akbar as he murders American soldiers. That's in 2009. Also in 2009, another fellow, Muslim, gets on a flight, and over the city of Chicago, as the plane is coming into a landing, tries to light his underwear on fire because he has stocked his undershorts with bombs to try to do the same thing that the shoe bomber tried to do. Was it over Chicago or over Detroit? It was over either one of those major American cities. And had the plane gone down there, lots of people on the ground would have gotten killed, as well as everyone on the plane. Like the shoe bomber, he had the living stuff and beaten out of him by the other passengers to prevent him from killing everyone on board. In 2010, a van was captured, and the guy who left it there was found filled with explosives with a detonator that failed to work. The bomb should have gone off. But the man went to an online website that our intelligence service had infiltrated, and basically the instructions on how to build a functioning bomb were wrong. And he followed them. So, no bomb, no boom, no big bada boom. Not them. If only our enemies were all so stupid. In 2011, a lot of Arab street movements begin, and a number of Arab governments are overthrown. This is sort of a roll of the dice, because the old Arab governments may have been unpopular and harsh, but they were mostly friends of America. Some of the new governments weren't so much. In Egypt, they elected the Muslim Brotherhood to power. Muslim Brotherhood are connected to the people who were involved with Haj Amin al-Husseini back in World War II. And they were a terror group in the mid-20th century, and they had some ties even now. They ended up being overthrown by the Egyptian army with American help and support because they were talking about getting rid of the alliance with, or the peace treaty with Israel. And that would have brought war to the Middle East. In Syria, a civil war begins that's still going on. Now, in that civil war in Syria, the government, the unpopular government, backed later by the Russians, has military weapons, including poison gas. And there are reports coming out of Syria that he's bombing whole civilian populations with napalm, which is gelatinized gasoline lit on fire that sticks to everything, and with poison gas, with chlorine gas, and even with mustard gas. Now, this is something that hasn't been done since World War I, except for the limited exchanges in the Iran-Iraq War. President Obama says this is a red line. If we get word that this happens again, bad things will happen to Bashar Assad and his government in Syria. They do it again, and again, and again, and we do nothing. In fact, the Russians start sending troops into Syria to help Assad. They haven't been involved in the Middle East since before the Yom Kippur War, and we do nothing. So now the Russians have bases in Syria. And the Syrian civil war is still going on. A number of Syrians begin migrating out of Syria to avoid all this, and they end up going to Europe, starting a mass migration of military-aged Arab men that leave the Middle East because of ongoing turmoil and end up in Europe claiming asylum as refugees. And these groups are so massive that they have begun to change the character of all of Europe's countries. This large number of Islamic immigrants is really challenging a lot of what Europeans have taken for granted about their lives. And it's one of the reasons for a number of modern policies, like the British leaving the European Union. They didn't want to be exposed to ongoing immigration. The Hungarians and the Poles say, we're not taking immigrants. The Germans said, we're taking 1 million. Okay, in a country of 80 million, 1 million people is a lot. Well, New Year's Day 2016, I think it was, in Germany, on New Year's Eve and the night, there are a bunch of parties all over the country. It's traditional. You go out, you're with your friends, you drink, you sing. If you're an adult, you drink adult beverages. Throughout Germany, dozens and dozens of women are raped that night by gangs of Middle Eastern men. Because in the old country, women walking around alone without men and without headdress were asking for it, which is a kind of thinking that we Westerners have tried to put out of our minds. We do not usually blame the victims of rape for being raped, but that's what the Muslim rapists said, because that's what they were used to back home. So this arrival of people from a completely different culture with completely different ways is really challenging a lot of European societies, European countries. Okay, in 2011 also, we find out that the Pakistani army in their town where they have their army academy, leave it open, is sheltering Osama bin Laden. And so we kill him. We send in the SEALs. He fights, we kill him, and we dump his body off an aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean for the sharks. Tomorrow, I will finish this with a short lecture, and you will, if you have permission, have the link to see Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West. On Monday, you have Chapter Survey 2 due. You'll be taking a quiz on Chapter Survey 2. Your terrorism essays are due. And Monday or Tuesday, you may also get an extended quiz on everything I've covered, from the Prophet Abraham up to the current day, to the death of bin Laden, at least. Thank you. Adios. Videos will end, as will the stream. Bye-bye.